Welcome to the second day of the inaugural symposium of the Debates in Archaeology series. And thank you so much for all of you for attending. Again, I extend my thanks to all 7 panelists and keynote speakers. I greatly enjoyed the discussion yesterday, and I'm confident that today's speakers will sustain the high caliber of debate engendered by the stimulating keynote addresses. Once again, I'd like to share with you the university's Land Acknowledgement Declaration. We would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community and on this territory. Thank you. So as outlined in the program, today 5 speakers will lecture for about 25 minutes or so, and we'll then invite the panelists and members of the audience to pose questions following each talk. So like yesterday, questions can be posed by writing queries in the chat function, which we'll monitor continuously. Alternatively, you're welcome to raise your hand via the Zoom prompt and ask your question directly, time permitting. And I'm thinking everyone can actually see and read the questions, so I won't so tediously read them out as I did yesterday, and I apologize if that didn't quite work out. But to get things started and keep things on time, I'm really delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Oliver Harris of the University of Leicester. Dr. Harris has written extensively on archaeological theory and new materialist approaches, including a widely assigned textbook co-authored with our own Craig Cipolla. Dr. Harris has also made important contributions to understanding long-term history of gender and use of materials in Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain. He is currently conducting fieldwork in Ardnamurchan, Western Scotland. I think I pronounced that right, is that right? And as director of this project, Dr. Harris has activated sites from the early Neolithic to 19th century in Scotland, including Neolithic burials, Bronze Age settlements, Iron Age cremations, post-medieval houses, and the first Viking boat burial discovered on the UK mainland. His talk this morning is entitled, "What Do We Mean by Relational Anyway?" And with that, I'm very happy to turn the podium virtually over to Ali. Thank you, Ali, so much for being here today.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks everybody for the Toronto for the invitation. Ardnamurchan, I think is how it's pronounced. So you're pretty close. And to be honest with you, any Gaelic speakers would tell you that I was miles off as well. So we'll go with that. Hopefully I can share my screen. Is that working for everybody? If someone give me a...
It looks good. It looks great. Thanks.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. You'll notice there's a slight change in my title, which I'll reflect on as we go through today's talk. I thought last night was absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoyed both the keynote speakers' talks and also the conversation afterwards. I really would have liked a week to rewrite this paper, I think, to reflect on all the things I learned last night. But I don't have that, so we're just going to go with it anyway. Let's see how this goes. So for many years now, I've conceptualized the work that I do as an example of relational archaeology. That means that rather than thinking about the world as full of bounded entities, I, along with many archaeologists, focus on how people, places, and things emerge through their connections to one another. Yet a critical issue here is that archaeologists are not always clear about what they mean by the term relational. Chris Watts offers one definition of relationality as, quote, "a suite of approaches aimed at conflating the abstract and immutable dualities of modernist ontologies." Okay, but once this conflation has been completed and the move to identify relations has begun, we are still left with a whole set of questions. What actually are relations? Are all relations equal? If not, how do we begin to divide them up, to qualify them, to describe them? Do the relations we are describing refer to what people in the past thought about the world, or to a more basic underlying metaphysical commitment on the behalf of the archaeologist that the world is relational? In today's talk, I want to explore these issues with the relations as well as others through a tripartite structure. First, I want to look back at the past and set out a partial genealogy of relations in the area of archaeology in which I work. Second, I'm going to set out where we currently are with relations as I see it. Third, I'm going to think about some of the criticisms of relational approaches and what this means for the future. The paper I'm giving today is both a presentation of and a development on the chapter I've written for our forthcoming book, Archaeological Theory and Dialogue. It will say some things that that chapter doesn't, but it will also, perhaps inevitably given the time, gloss over some of the more substantial parts of that argument. So consider that a plug for go and read the book, please. Thank you very much. I want to make one final point before I go on. One of the most important processes of writing archaeological theory and dialogue for me was the way it forced me to reflect on my own position and subjectivity. I want to stress from the outset that the perspective I'm offering here today on both the history of archaeological thought and the issues of relational approaches in the present is one of a white European, heterosexual and, sadly, middle-aged man, somewhere in mid-career who studies the European past. I'll return to this positionality in the end to reflect why it isn't just solipsistic navel-gazing. It's also why there's that subtle name change in the title of my talk, which I referred to at the beginning. The interest in relations in archaeology can be traced back to at least the start of the post-processualism. However, in the traditions of archaeology in which I work, it was approaches to personhood at the turn of the millennium that were absolutely critical. John Chapman, Chris Fowler and Joanna Brooke all developed relational accounts of identity, drawing more or less explicitly on ethnographic analogies with Melanesia. These approaches suggested that notions of the individual were historically specific, and that imposing this onto the past was deeply problematic. In their place, they offered relational accounts of personhood, postulating notions of enchainment, partible or permeable personhood, individuality, and so on. Relations here were drawn out through anthropological analogy and highly influenced by the feminism of those accounts. In parallel to this, a second line of thought opened up a more philosophical critique, arguing for a relational perspective. Here, phenomenological philosophy was particularly critical. Julian Thomas, for example, drew on Heidegger's work to argue for a relational understanding of the world, not just in terms of people's identities, but at a far more fundamental level. Paralleled in many ways by the work of Tim Ingold in anthropology, who drew both upon indigenous perspectives, of course, and the work of Heidegger. This set the scene in British archaeology for a full-blown relational turn. Over the last 20 years, this emphasis on relations has grown in multiple different directions. Influenced by the growth of symmetrical archaeology in Scandinavia and the United States, there has been some interest in relational approaches influenced by Bruno Latour, although this remains a rather minor line of thinking in studies of the British and European past, I would say. A more significant area of growth has been approaches developing out of readings of new materialism, assemblage theory, post-humanist feminism, and so on. We'll hear more about those later, both from myself and of course from Rachel this afternoon or this evening, whatever time zone you happen to be in. So this extremely brief and very partial genealogy offers one route through the myriad paths archaeology has taken to get to the present. Its aim was not to sketch a true history, but rather to show you the history of my thoughts and my perspective upon it. From this, I now want to broaden my gaze to consider a wider take on relations, and in particular, where we are with relations as a discipline now. In my chapter in Archaeological Theory and Dialogue, I suggest we can separate current approaches to relations into three parts. I want to stress here that this division is somewhat arbitrary, and you could certainly put it together differently. First, there are what I term relations as epistemology. This approach treats relations as critical elements of how past people understood the world. It makes the claim that past people saw the world as relational, and this is revealed in how they treat objects, the dead, their architecture, and so on. Accounts of personhood in the British and European past fall neatly into this category, as do some North American archaeologists' account of indigenous personhood. Eleanor Harrison Buck and Julia Hendon, for example, introduced their recent excellent volume on relational identities by stating that such a relational approach involves a conscious awareness in the world of one's positioning and activity in the world as a reciprocal and relational being. The stress placed on conscious awareness indicates that relationality here depends upon human engagement. It is not a statement about how the world works, regardless of what people think about it. It is for this reason I have termed these approaches relations as epistemology. They're about relations in how people know the world. Now, without question, these approaches offer us a series of useful tools for thinking about relations. They tend to rely heavily on ethnographic data, which can be highly appropriate where direct historical connections exist, if somewhat more tenuous in European cases that rely on analogy. In both contexts, however, the relations that are described are curtailed to those of which people are aware. These are not, despite the claims sometimes made, ontological accounts. They do not, therefore, amount to a complete account of how relations shape the world past and present. A second set of approaches have focused on relations as a methodological tool for thinking about the past. Less concerned with past people's understanding of relations, these argue that we can trace and detect particular connections in the material record. The most explicit of these is network analysis. Network analysis offers archaeologists the means to examine the relations between different archaeological entities, be they specific features, people, sites, or regions. They examine nodes and the relations that connect them and provide archaeologists with a methodology for describing certain elements. Whilst relations can be quantified through these kinds of analysis, given values such as strong and weak and take a variety of forms, they often still remain under-examined theoretically and are secondary to the nodes that they connect. Now, this is not to say that relations do not matter in these approaches, they clearly do, but nonetheless they matter because of the effect they have on the nodes. They do not have an independent existence. Network analysis can certainly be combined with more philosophical approaches to relations, as both Karl Nappert and Ian Hodder have shown, but nonetheless, in contrast to relational concepts of personhood, where relations to what constitute people and are primary, nodes come first in this analysis and relationships afterwards. This clearly differentiates it from the approaches we will examine below as well. The final set of approaches to relations I want to outline are those that treat relations as a form of metaphysics following Ben's terms. That is, a fundamental underlying reality. These approaches draw on a multitude of different inspirations, including both Western and indigenous philosophies. I've mentioned some of these approaches already, but we can include here phenomenology, new materialism, assemblage theory, post-humanist feminism, agential realism, symmetrical archaeology, at least in its early phases, and more. In the United States, authors like Tim Porketat have combined elements of new materialism with indigenous ideas of bundling to provide an approach to the world which is both metaphysical and informed by European and indigenous concepts. This approach does not reduce relations to what people thought about the world, but rather elevates relations to the fundamental building blocks of reality. Indeed, Porketat and Susan Alt have offered perhaps the clearest definition of what a relation is from a metaphysical perspective when they say, quote, relations are those physical properties, experiential qualities, and other flows or movements of substances, materials, and phenomena that become attached to, entangled, or associated with others, and, in the process, define not only people, but other organisms, things, places, and the like. This broader reconsideration of relations as a form of metaphysics has led to a host of new interpretations of the past, but also to wider reconsiderations of a broad range of topics, including how we teach, how we conceptualize change, and how the past emerges, and so on. Three of my favorites on the screen here, and Rachel has paid me considerable amounts of money to make sure her book is front and center, I assure you. Now, I want to stress here that there's some pretty significant differences between the various approaches to relations as metaphysics that I'm lumping together here. Indeed, much of the work I've tried to do in the last 3 or 4 years has been to show why it matters that we don't just combine these different approaches together and presume that the same criticisms can be applied to all of them. However, discussing that in detail will be the subject for another lengthy lecture, so I will resist the temptation to pass these different approaches at this stage. Instead, I want to say a little bit more about the approach I take to relations, which certainly falls into the relations as metaphysics camp. My approach is explicitly inspired by the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, both in his own work and in conjunction with Félix Guattari. Much as I would like to, and let me rephrase that, much as I would love to bore you all to tears with my exact take on Deleuzean philosophy, I will restrain that here. Instead, I want to flag 3 elements of this approach that will be particularly important in the final part of the paper. The first move that Deleuze makes that matters to us here is in his switch from emphasizing what things are to what things do, or in philosophical terms, from being to becoming. This move is critical for Deleuze because it demands that we focus on the conjunctions and relations in the world, on the linkages that bring things together and change what they can do, on the word "and," as he puts it, capitalized normally. Is a diamond ring an amalgam of a carbon crystal structure that formed 1 billion years ago and a piece of shaped ductile metal with the atomic number 79? Is it a piece of jewelry that emphasizes the love and commitment one person has for another? Is it a family heirloom that embodies biographies and histories of relations? Or is it a product of generations of patriarchy that embodies capitalist, Oedipal, and heteronormative sensibilities? Or is it the outcome of exploitative colonial histories that take the natural resources of nations with things like diamonds and gold and turn them into baubles for rich people in other countries? Deleuze would ask you to reject these choices. Rather than asking what it is, as per those questions, instead ask what something does. As soon as you do that, you can move from having to choose between our different interpretations towards emphasizing how they can all be real, replacing the question of what something is, as if that could ever be singular, with the conjunction and, linking each of them together. Our present day statues, symbols of oppression, memories of the past, aesthetic objects of appreciation, navigation markers, or the relational outcome of different materials. Yes to all, and more besides. This emphasis on conjunction leads us to the second element, that relations are always relations of affect. From his work on Spinoza, Deleuze makes the important claim, nobody knows what a body can do. What he means by this is that the capacities of a body, and not necessarily a human body, are not determined in advance, but rather emerge relationally. For Deleuze and for Spinoza, this relational emergence happens through affect, through the capacity to affect and be affected, to press into other bodies and be pressed into in turn. Deleuze and Guattari famously cite von Uxküll's analysis of a tick to consider how this insect lives its life through three intertwining sets of affects: a sensitivity to light, smell, and heat. Affects are relations. The way in which a cat rushes across a wooden floor and scratches the paint is an example of affect. The way in which acidic soil slowly eats away the flesh of a buried loved one is an example of affect. So too is the way in which a sudden crash from the kitchen causes you to jump or gasp. But if there's a crash from my kitchen now, I really will gasp. New relations create new capacities for affect, new possibilities to affect and be affected. This means that any engagement is fundamentally open-ended. The outcomes need mapping anew each time. Finally, these are relations of difference. One way of thinking of relations is simply as a form of connection, that two things are linked or hold something in common. However, once we recognize the centrality of affect, then we have to acknowledge that relations are things that make a difference. They produce a change in bodies they connect and increase or decrease a body's capacity for action. Bodies emerge through relationships because relationships have the capacity to differentiate bodies. When a modern sculptor works with wood to produce a piece of art, or a Neolithic person works with stone to make an axe, the relations between person, material, and other objects they may be using act to differentiate the sculpture or the stone from the material. These relations produce new bodies through the fact they make a difference. These three elements, the conjoining and, affect, and difference, are by no means the only elements of Deleuze's take on relations that matter. I am pained beyond belief to not be able to discourse at length on the important claim that relations are external to their terms, but you can't have everything in life. In the paper so far, I have traced one particular genealogy of relations and characterized current approaches into falling into three specific camps. In this final part of the paper, I want to sketch out some of the criticisms of relational approaches in archaeology and how I, as someone committed to relations, might respond. The first criticism of relational approaches is that if we take the claim to be metaphysical, that the world is relational, then describing any one part of it as relational individually tells us very little about this. In this vein, Darrell Wilkinson has pointed out that if we take the whole world as relationally constituted, then discussing personhood, for example, as being more or less relational makes little sense. Similarly, Astrid van Ooyen has emphasized that simply stating that things are relational may be true, but it is only trivially true. She argues that we need to become much better at describing sets of relations or relational constellations in her terms. I take both of these criticisms to heart. It is quite clear that the future of archaeological approaches to relations requires us to explore in much greater detail what relations are, how they work, how they can be described and understood. This fits precisely with the Deleuzean approach I outlined above, of course. Deleuze isn't suggesting that it is enough to recognize the world as relational. We need to know what differences those relations make, the affects they have, and how these are historically specific and emergent. Though I do not have space to describe them here, Deleuze's philosophy offers us a host of ways of describing relations in their immanent historical expression. from their intensive and extensive qualities, via the degree to which they are coded or stratified, and so on. We can also draw on the terms of Charles Sanders Peirce, as Deleuze and Guattari do in 1,000 Plateaus, and Deleuze does in his cinema books, to further specify how icons, indices, and symbols gather different kinds of relations to them. If you're interested in this, it's part of my chapter in Archaeological Theory and Dialogue. Thus, I take the critique of relations as being bland as important, but fundamentally a call for us to do better at describing them, rather than to abandon such approaches altogether. A second line of critique has been more direct in its suggestion that archaeologists need to move away from a reliance on relations. In archaeology, for example, Chris Whitmore and Bjorn Olsen have suggested that their own work in the early phases of symmetrical archaeology, quote, placed more emphasis on the assemblages and entanglements than on the autonomy and integrity of things. This criticism can be traced back to Olsen's earlier arguments in his book In Defense of Things, where he suggests that we have now reached the limits of where relational thinking can take us. This critique of relations draws primarily on ideas taken from object-orientated ontology, or OOO, and in particular from Graham Harman. Harman's been a vocal critic of relational approaches for some time. He accuses relational thinkers variously of undermining, that is, reducing objects to their constituent relations, overmining, presuming objects only exist in as much as they relate to other things, or worst of all, duomining, doing both at the same time. In all three cases, Harman argues that relational approaches leave no space for objects themselves, that we need to recognize that objects have a, quote, withdrawn essence. However, if you're interested in actually engaging with the past in writing history, it's quite difficult to understand how one squares this with such an essence. How do such essences emerge historically? Excuse me. At what point does the essence of the pot you are carefully shaping with your hands come to abide in the vessel? Harman's own attempt to write history, for example, his account of the Dutch East India Company in his book Immaterialism, actually deals more with specific forms of relations, what he terms symbiotic relations, than it does with essences. It seems as if relations are critical to explaining historical emergence, even for the essence-embracing world of OOO. My own view is that their broader critique of relations is also problematic. This is for three reasons, at least from a Deleuzean perspective. First, it ignores the way in which in Deleuze's work, objects do not emerge from relations, but rather in parallel with them. Second, it ignores the manner in which Deleuze and Guattari, far from undermining singular things, emphasize the specificity and event-like quality of assemblages. Finally, as Chris Fowler and I have explored at length, one can shift perspectives from examining an object as an individual thing, or at a different scale, one part of a wider set of components. The choice then between individuation and relations is a false one. The final criticism, I think, is the most profound challenge to the kind of metaphysical relational approach that I support. That's the Deleuzean argument I put forward here. And this comes from Ben Alberti's powerful critique that approaches like mine risk overrunning the world with a unified and homogeneous ontology, a meta-ontology as he calls it. What we lose here, Alberti argues, is the genuine possibility of encountering ontological difference. For Alberti, the promise of an ontological archaeology is the encounter with radical difference, with alterity. The risk, therefore, in employing the relations as metaphysics approach I set out above, is that alterity is denied and suppressed. Sure, we're no longer imposing a world of uniformly opposed nature and culture, or elevating human beings to a higher ontological plane, but nor can we access the encounter with ontological difference. Instead, a new imposition of assemblages, rhizomes, hexaeties, smooth and striated space, networks, whatever else you like, takes place. Alberti argues instead for an encounter with indigenous thought as theory, and with that, the capacity to engage with the past in new ways and to open up the possibility for local, emergent, and specific ontological difference. The moment when the analyst's own conceptions and concepts are transformed. And Ben, in the questions, you can tell me just how badly I've butchered your argument there. This pretty brief summary. Hopefully it's not too wrong. Now, I wanted to suggest that this critique, and I want to stress, in fact, that this critique gives me enormous pause for thought. And it's something in various ways that in the book, myself and my co-author spend a lot of time debating. Meta-ontology is probably the single most contested term in the whole thing. Nevertheless, I'm going to stick with a Deleuzean position on relations. And in the final couple of minutes of my talk, I'm going to sketch out why. First, we need to return to where I started, with my position as an archaeologist, with my location and subjectivity, the very model of a majoritarian subject. This creates a very specific set of theoretical needs for my work. In particular, I need the tools that are aimed at picking away at the fundamental assumptions built into the major traditions of Euro-American thought. It is here that I find Deleuze's work and his account of relations so powerful. In a recent article, the feminist philosopher Claire Colebrook explores the power of Deleuze to break down these concepts for those of us locked into the dominant traditions of Western philosophy. She compares recent critiques of Deleuze by both a Euro-American, Alexander Galloway, and Eve Tuck, who we were hearing about last night, an Indigenous academic. Colebrook finds much food for thought in Tuck's critique, quite a lot less in Galloway's, it has to be said. Nonetheless, she suggests that, quote, only Deleuze and Guattari can help us imagine life without this world, life without the world. Now, by us, Colebrook is specifically referring to Western academics, steeped in particular traditions of thinking, deconstruction, phenomenology, modernity in general. She goes on to acknowledge that those who approach the world from alternative perspectives, indigenous or otherwise, may well have no need for such a grand exit, as she puts it. Now, I'm not a philosopher, and I wouldn't make any claim as bold as Colebrook's that only Deleuze and Guattari can help Euro-American thinkers. All I know is they help me. And they help me because of the emphasis on difference, on opening up, on positivity, and on creation. The aim of Deleuzean philosophy is to disrupt what Deleuze calls the image of thought, and to do so by exploring and mapping the flows, forces, and conjunctions of the relations of the world. This works for me because it creates an attentiveness to the specificities of the past, to materials I encounter as an archaeologist. So when I write about the Neolithic, Deleuze draws my attention to specific sets of relations, singularities, in order to explain the general, to how difference, affect, and intensity focus me towards a world of becoming. This allows me to create space for Neolithic materials, relations, sites, and monuments to co-author that outcome. Here I argue that the fundamental Deleuzean emphasis on difference, on and on affect that we saw earlier, allows for precisely the encounter with the unexpected for which Alberti calls for. By embracing the idea that relations are fundamentally differential, we can also incorporate the critical concept that what counts as a relation may itself vary. This means that our exploration of relations must always be based in the immanent historical context which we are investigating. Throughout this, relations remain critical. As Yvonne Marshall puts it, a truly transformative ontology can therefore be neither one nor many, neither singular nor multiple, but must in some way be relational. My argument here parallels Eduardo Viveras de Castro, of course, who speaks of a certain becoming Deleuzian of Amerindian ethnology and a certain becoming Indian of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. My aim, working in and on the Neolithic of Europe, is to allow for a becoming Neolithic of Deleuze and Guattari, and with that, inevitably, a becoming Deleuzian of the Neolithic. Deleuze and Guattari argue that philosophy is the creation of concepts, and Viveras de Castro morphs this in his creation of concepts using Amerindian thought. The aim, in my view, of a relational approach that encounters archaeology through a Deleuzian lens must be the creation of new concepts co-authored by the past, the philosophy, and of course, the archaeologist. And that's what I mean by relational anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie, very much. Great talk. We can open up the panel for discussion. The panelists. Yes, Ben, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. That was as clear and as intelligent as your talks are. And it's funny when you're on Zoom and you tell a joke, you don't hear anyone laughing, so you're not sure how it went over, but they were funny.
Thanks.
So there are lots of things, obviously, that your talk has brought up, but I'm going to pause on one of them that occurs to me, and I'm not sure, this could be jumbled thinking on my part. So if I could paraphrase your argument that Deleuze and Guattari are useful for you to think through difference, and I enjoyed very much the way you talked about it at the end in terms of Viveras de Castro. That made a lot of sense to me, but it still occurs to me that are we left in a situation where, let's say, indigenous philosophies, approaches, if I can refer to Keisha's talk from yesterday, local and specific, but for the European past, you're using still kind of universal theory, right? As opposed to universal from a given perspective, not universal from all perspectives, which is ours. So do we still have a European past which is in some way using the universalizing theories, whereas we have lots of other kind of local pasts that are not? And does that not replicate some kind of problematic move?
I mean, I think for me, I mean, the question of the universal is very interesting, right? I mean, Paris, where Deleuze is writing, and Stonehenge are not very far apart, even in European terms, let alone in the kind of size of the maps of a particular indigenous group in North America would be much bigger than that scale. So in terms of actual scale of space, we're talking quite small gaps here in terms of those spaces. But time, obviously, we're looking at an enormous temporal depth by comparison. So there is a kind of overriding element here. I think it's not about the universalizing or not universalizing. It's about what does the approach allow you to do. So the key thing and what makes Deleuze different, and what makes Deleuze work for me, and there may well be other philosophers that work differently for other people. And I've certainly been guilty in the past of kind of proclaiming, oh, look, this is the way forward, follow this light. And I've learned really through the process of working on archaeological theory and dialogue that it's much more important to me to position myself and my own engagement quite carefully. But the point about Deleuze-Guattari's philosophy and Deleuze's philosophy is that it is about opening up difference. So that universality forces you to engage with the particular, right? It is a philosophy that is directly aimed at using the singular first to move to the general, and not the general to move to the singular. Now, to a certain extent, absolutely, there is a Deleuzean flavor then, if you'd like, to the things that I'm going to write about. But what I don't have is, personally, are the tools to approach that past and allow the difference that I encounter there to speak or to communicate with me or to appear in my writing without a set of techniques or tools to open up that difference. And the way I'm trying to do that, and successfully or not, is a completely different kettle of fish, I think. But what I'm trying to do is use those tools to allow that difference. So the absence of universality comes not from Deleuze and Guattari. It's because of the way Deleuze and Guattari emphasize the singular, and then because of the particular encounter with the materials. So it's by encountering the Neolithic of Britain, for example, where you're face to face with an enormous monument, right? That you have to kind of deal with the difference of that. Something like Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric person-made mound in Europe. And you're like, okay, how do I engage with the difference of this that this face puts to me? And for me, Deleuze-Guattari opens up the possibility of a dialogue or a conversation, a different kind of assemblage, a becoming, where those things meet and bounce off each other and produce something new. That's the idea. Now, again, I don't know how successful that will be in my work moving forward, but that's what I'm trying to do with it. So the move away from universalizing is not to say, oh, right, you should approach Argentinian ceramics with Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy, right? Or that Lindsay working in the Southwest should approach Pueblos with it, or Sophie looking at Byzantine archaeology should use it. I think that kind of claim of philosophy at the grand scale is a dominant element of Western thought. But I think Deleuze and Guattari, and probably other minoritarian traditions, I'm sure Rachel would want to put in post-humanist feminism here and the work that she does with that, asks us to kind of think about the particular, to think about the minoritarian, to open up room for difference. And so I think that helps us resist that universalizing trend. And then because we're archaeologists, we're encountering that past, that material that pushes back and helps shape that. Sorry, that's quite a long and convoluted answer, but it's a critical question, I think.
Yes, thank you, Ali. Good question, Ben. Yes, Craig. Thank you.
Yeah, Ollie, I was really struck. I really liked how you framed it. Obviously, I'm very familiar with your arguments and such, but I really liked how you framed it really from your particular positionality in the world. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about, is that something that you think is very common in archaeological theory today? Like one of the things you talked about is sort of symmetrical archaeology, or whatever they call themselves today, and Graham Harman. Now it strikes me that Graham Harman, now I might not agree with most of his ideas, but he's willing to go and sit and talk with someone like Manuel de Landa, who he disagrees with, a relational archaeologist, relational thinker. And I'm just wondering if you could think about, is this a unique time in archaeological theory where we're starting to really focus on these like individual, you know, our situatedness and our positionality, and not trying to have everyone see the world in the same way. And maybe that's related to Ben Alberti's work as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely something that I've been forced to respond to by Ben's work and by Ben's critique of work like mine and those broader symmetrical and new materialist approaches. It's absolutely something I've had to respond to. I think it's also about, I mean, I think that the career structures and academic discourse privilege the idea that you're going to make grand claims and that you're going to position your particular approach as the answer. And archaeological theory is more guilty of that than probably any other aspect of archaeology, right? We've grown up on the stories of the great transformations of culture history to processual and processual to post-processual, right? Where the great man, and most of the time they've been declared to be men, despite the enormous influence of, for example, feminist archaeology on post-processualism, get to be very senior professors at very senior universities and get taught in courses and still crop up in my archaeological theory course left, right, and centre, right? So I think that let's be specific. I have been guilty of trying to perform that kind of role, of trying to say, yeah, I've got big ideas and I think they're important and people should listen to me. And that, of course, is, you know, it's classic white privilege, basically, isn't it? It's white male privilege that you've got ideas that everyone else should listen to. And so I think that it is about a moment we're in, but not in archaeological theory. I think it's a moment we're in politically. I think this is about the growing indigenous and voices, Black Lives Matter. I think this is new voices in feminist philosophy. I think this is a kind of critique that if we engage with, I mean, it's the privilege of the majoritarian subject to not have had to previously reflect on your own subjectivity, right? That's classic level one critical race theory point, right? And yes, I'm probably a massive idiot for only having grasped that relatively recently, but it's something that I'm trying to reflect on and work with now. And so kind of, you know, you could say, well, why don't you just abandon your previous positions? And partly it's because I spent bloody years reading Deleuze and it's bloody hard and I don't really want to throw that out the window. But it's also because I think there is a reason why Deleuze and Guattari are really key for post-humanist feminist philosophers, why they can speak to other kinds of traditions in interesting kinds of ways, why Viveris Castro finds them useful to engage with Amerindian thought, for example. And so I do think there's something we can gain out of that. So I think it is about a broader political moment we're in. Some of us are in. Sadly, it's not universal in our society, but either in North America or in the UK by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a moment that some of us find ourselves in. And I think that's something to celebrate and build on as a more collective range of voices that we can all hear and engage with now.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, Oliver. I wanted to ask you a question about the change in title and going from we to I. Can you tell me a little bit about when that happened for you or how that process worked for you? Because the title on our program is we, and how that relates to these questions of sort of situatedness and individuality and sort of understanding the sort of our own intersections of identity and where we sit within that.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's happened relatively recently. I mean, the title of my chapter in the book that's coming out is what do we mean by relational anyway? So that's the title. So when Ed says send in a thing, I go, okay, yeah, I'll send in the title and the abstract of my paper because, you know, we've got 5 million things to do. And at the time, we don't really give it any thought because that's a conference in Toronto in X number of months' time and there's a global pandemic and what have you. I'll deal with it later. But for me, it's a process. And one of the things Craig's very good on in the book, I think he talks about a process like decolonization is always a process. He talks about it can't ever be finished, right? And in a Deleuzean term, it's a becoming, right? It's something that's always going on and the change is always happening. So I can trace it to a specific moment where the 5 of us were, that finger is the shape people are on my screen, by the way, which is why I'm drawing through my co-authors on the book. We're sitting around talking about when we were first writing together in a room at Syracuse in New York, just before Syracuse Tag. And we were talking about our position. And that was one moment for me where I was really reflecting on it and I was thinking about my position. I found actually talking about my position very difficult because all of my co-authors in their different ways have reflected much more seriously on their own position than I had, whether that's because of their gender or their ethnicity or their sexuality or their kind of class backgrounds, whatever it might be. I'm like middle class, like I said, a kind of model of a majoritarian subject. But it still didn't occur to me to move my title from we to I until in between submitting the talk and deciding how I was going to change it, what I wanted to do differently about it, because I didn't just want to re-give my paper. So I'm kind of thinking, I want to change this, I want to change that. And I know Ben's a keynote speaker, so I really wanted to bring out some of the things that I've been thinking about. And I kind of got to the end and went, this isn't we, it's I. This is what I think about relations. And I want to acknowledge that by changing it. And I wanted to do the cross out, not just the change, because that shift is a becoming. There's a really nice line at the start of Deleuze's book, Dialogues, with he and Claire Parnett have these dialogues. And he talks about a conversation is a kind of echo of a becoming or something like that. And I think that the dialogue I've had with my co-authors, the dialogue that we had last night, listening to your talk, listening to Ben's talk, and the process of continual reflection and work is the process by which that changes from we to I. And so if anyone gets the book, you'll see it says we in the top of it. And because I don't propose for a moment that I'll ever solve that process of reflecting on my subjectivity and privilege and all those sorts of things. It's a consistent process of work for me, certainly. And, you know, again, like literally, I wrote this paper this week because obviously I've had a million things to do. So it was about Wednesday, I went, this is I, what am I talking about? So really recently.
Additional questions from the panelists? We have 3 questions. Great. Can you see them, Ollie, from Andy Roddick?
Oh, yeah, I can see 2 questions.
Yeah, and Hannah Chazen.
So,
and there's also a comment
from
Danny Demaray.
Oh, sorry, didn't see that. Yeah.
Is that some of them in the chat and some are in the question? I'll deal with the questions because I've got them right in front of me at the moment, and I'll look at the chat in a moment. This is like Zoom is complicated, man. And so Andy's asking, do the tools that Deleuze, I'm sorry to read out, this is literally reading it to my head because I haven't read it yet. Do the tools that Deleuze offers not have to be transformed in the very practice act of archaeology and the kinds of encounters you were discussing for the Neolithic? At what point does our archaeological praxis require some sort of shift in our own Deleuzean-inspired language? Keisha was hinting at this yesterday, and maybe you're getting at that, Ollie, but can you give an example of how new concepts are co-authored by the past? That's a great question, absolutely brilliant question. There are 2 aspects for me there. One is actually methodological, right, which is what do we do with this stuff from the past? And I thought Keisha's discussion of databases yesterday was absolutely brilliant as an example of that. And it's something that on my field project that I co-direct with a number of people, including Hannah Cobb, who was certainly previously listening to this, we've thought about how our recording methodologies produce the kind of way in which we engage with the past. And that is something that requires further work and reflection. So how are we categorizing finds, all those kinds of things. I mean, in a way, I was wondering last night whether much more so than the specific concepts Keisha was employing in her paper, that methodological transformation is something that could move across to the British Neolithic really quite. It's not that you'd move the same relational database, if you like, but it's the idea of constructing a relational database that could move across in really interesting ways. In terms of like, how did that work in terms of new concepts? What I'm trying to write about at the moment in a book that will one day be finished if there ever isn't a global pandemic, is thinking about how concepts emerge from my encounter with the Neolithic. So to give an example, one of the things that has struck me is about how we write about power in the past and how we write about the kinds of power that's held. And this is particularly emerged through my conversations with Rachel. Rachel will be talking about power later on. And I've tried to think through how one of the things that we learn from Deleuze and one of the things we learn from Michel Foucault and we learn from people like Brian Masumi is how particular modes of power emerge in particular periods of time. Foucault's a classic, right? He does disciplinary power and biopower and all those sorts of things, which are obviously not appropriate for the Neolithic Britain. But through a Deleuzean approach, what I've tried to do is develop a concept of what I call monupower, which is a way of thinking about monuments as powerful and not as seats of power, not as things that create powerful people, not as metaphors for power or expressions of power, but as power itself. And that emerges through a kind of engagement with Deleuze's work and other people as well, people like Masumi, hugely influenced by Deleuze, and with the material. And so that neo-concept, as I would call it, a new concept, is emergent out of my engagement with that. And it's a way of trying to talk about Neolithic monuments, which obviously dominate the debate of that period in Britain, in ways that they haven't been talked about before. So that's how I'm trying to do that, I suppose. And then the second question from Eleanor Harrison, thank you for the excellent talk. Thank you very much. Can you speak more about the need for separating your three relational approaches? From my perspective, part of the problem is the separation of the thinking and the doing, which seems to be perpetuating the separation of these approaches. Can you speak more to this? Can the metaphysics position consider the human thinking or just the doing part? Yeah, thanks for that. And I want to stress that any kind of passing like that obviously puts people in one camp and they could be in the other. And your excellent book is one of those things that different parts of different papers I think could be put into different parts of those camps. I think there has been a problem with some new materialist accounts particularly that have steered away from meaning, from doing, from understanding, from belief, from those kinds of things. And part of that is a natural kind of knee-jerk reaction or the kind of knee-jerk reaction that happens when new archaeological theories emerge, where they go, oh, we're not like the old people. So post-processualism used to talk about knowing, now we're going to talk about doing and materials and all these other kinds of things. I actually think within these kinds of approaches, a metaphysical approach, there is room for the kinds of things that you're talking about. So just as we should be discussing the kind of specific capacities of clay that emerge in particular periods of the past, we should be thinking about the particular capacities for knowing that emerge in a particular period of the past. And the kind of ways of knowing the world in the Neolithic of Britain are not the same as in Pueblo context in the southwest of the United States, and that's as it should be. And I think we can talk about those things in different kinds of ways, but I would agree with you completely that there's been too little emphasis on that side of things, and that's something that needs more exploration by me and other people working with these kinds of approaches. And then Danny asks, what are your thoughts on how we might avoid the dichotomizing and or categorizing and or generalizing when looking at difference in comparisons? That's really difficult. I mean, I think for me, it's by constant, maybe it's because it's about a constantly reiterative process. So this is, I don't have a good answer to this, but the beginning of an answer might be, is that one of the kind of notions, again, of academic thought maybe has been that we solve problems. Here is a problem, I have solved it, now we move on, and it's done and dusted, okay? And so I've categorized this particular piece of pottery as a early Bronze Age pot, so it's definitely not a late Neolithic pot. And now I know that, and that's going to shape how I explore my sites or wherever else it might be. And of course, one of the things about a different kind of way of categorizing finds that Keisha was talking about last night is that would shift all of that stuff around. You put them in different associations, different net assemblages in my terms, or in Deleuze's terms. So I think part of the process may be that recognizing this is iterative and ongoing, that it's a process of becoming, so that categorization might be something that has to happen all of the time. There's a certain amount of, okay, when you get to a site, what have I got? What's here? How can I put this into different piles? But the idea is that we don't then fix those in those piles. Things move, things shift, things can jump from one place to another. And that allows us to get at difference, but maybe difference without dichotomies, so that you can think about qualities maybe that move across those groups that allow you to reconsider different materials that have textures in common rather than other kinds of links, or that are deposited together in particular kinds of ways, or that are associated with particular houses or sites or places. So I think in a way it's that, I think describing, differentiating, contextualizing, categorizing is part of the archaeological process that it may be quite difficult to ever completely escape from. But I think the key thing, and the problem with typology, if you like, which is the kind of great bête noire of this, is that once something is accorded a type, it remains fixed in that particular type forever. Whereas if we move away from the notion that there's a type, and that which relates presumably to some ideal pot off there back in the back of Plato's cave somewhere, that actually these things move and they shift and they change and they get recategorized and they form new relations, and we understand them differently as a result of that. That allows those differences to shift constantly and move about. And so if we embrace that iterative process, there may be a way out of that. And that's not a great answer, but it's a really important question, I think. Thank you.
And Ollie, there's some questions in the chat. If you go to the little chat window down below from Hannah Chazen. Hi, Hannah, beaming in from New York. And Van Jong has a question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Right. Okay, brilliant.
No, thank you.
Just looking for, Hannah's. Oh, there we are. Would it be fair to say that the sort of relational archaeology you are doing doesn't do much to solve the larger problems of historiography that Ben gestured towards? Or do you have a sense that a relational past is already a step towards dealing with issues of narrating universals in history? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Hannah. I think for me, one of the things I like about this particular approach is that it allows us to work at different kinds of scales. And so the local can be quite different. I don't have a problem with writing, for example, about long-term transformations of gender in Europe between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. I don't see that as inappropriate or too generalizing, or those anything like that, because I think archaeology by its nature is a really multi-scalar project that works at really huge, unbelievable timescales and moments impossible specificity of a funeral, a death, a pot smashing. And that's what I think is wonderful about it as a subject, basically, is this ridiculous scalar disparity that we have. So I do think that a relational approach is part of the way of picking away at universals. So I would argue that, for example, in the paper that I co-authored with John Robb, looking at these kind of big scale shifts in gender, we're not arguing that there is kind of a universal structure to gender. We're trying to think about how even at the biggest scales, gender works really differently in different kinds of time places, whilst having things in common, but in sets, if you like, relationships or assemblages that work at different kinds of ways. So I think the advantage of a relational approach is it draws us into a kind of certain amount of mapping what's going on in a particular kind of place, and requires us to pick away at something like, okay, well, we can take for granted that biological sex, for example, is the same throughout time and space. So what matters is how people interpret that as gender, which is a classic dualist, universalist model, right? And then we have different cultural expressions of gender, whether it's in the European past or it's anywhere else. But one of the things that I think we can learn from other approaches is, for example, from the way in which non-Western people address gender, is that isn't how that always works, and that sex-gender binary is a very particular way of looking at things. And so once you've got rid of that, once you approach these things relationally, we can then start to put things together in different kinds of ways. I hope that answers the question. If I work down this, Daryl Wilkinson says, thanks, Ollie. Does the transition from we to I actually change your interpretation of the British Neolithic itself, or is it just giving permission to others to be non-Deleuzian if they don't find it useful? Well, it's probably, thanks, Daryl. It's probably not from, I mean, it's not from, obviously it's not for me to give people permission or otherwise to do whatever they like. I think, I don't know whether it changes my interpretation of the Neolithic, but I think what's really important is trying to be honest and reflexive about the process of our own interpretation. Truth, if you like, which I think are much more in a kind of Latourian sense, is about how things get fixed in particular kinds of ways, doesn't work for me in like a correlational model of truth or a comparative model of truth in the way Chris Fowler talks about in his 2013 book, which he's been critical of, that there's a kind of past out here and what matters is how accurate our representation of it is. It's about mapping those moves that we make all the way through from one to the other, in order to get a sense of being open and reflexive and iterative about those processes. So I think moving from we to I makes my description of makes my account of my description and analysis of the Neolithic more accurate, because it's being accurate about what the process is that I'm doing. I don't know whether it changes my account of the Neolithic or not. I think Deleuze definitely does, but I don't know that. Ben, you've got your hand out. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, something occurs to me that I think it doesn't, if the language is no longer my interpretation, which is an important point to make, but there is an interpretation that comes forth as a consequence of your engagement with the material and the language you use. So I think it is a different Neolithic that comes out when you say my interpretation of the Neolithic. Thinking back to, I think, to Keisha's talk again yesterday, the groundedness, the positionality of the statement itself means you have a different Neolithic.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think definitely, yeah. I think there's at least one new question left. I feel like I'm really dominating though. Should I just carry on, or obviously I'm just going to wax lyrical and I don't want to take over everything. So can I carry on with the questions, Ed? Is that the best
schedule? We should probably end around 11:05, but this is the spirit of this forum, is to, foster debate and discussion. So
Okay, well, let's do the next one, because this one's been on waiting for ages, I think, as well. So I don't want to ignore anybody's question. And if anyone does have other questions and stuff like that, please do email me. And I'm sure that's true for all of the panelists. At least we'd be really happy to discuss things further, because there isn't that kind of going up to someone in the bar afterwards and having a chat. So if you want to get in touch, I'd be delighted to talk further with anybody. Anyway, so the next question says, thanks for the great talk. Very nice. Thank you very much. I'm definitely going to read those bits out. I have two questions. You mentioned that relations can be quantified while still be deep in theory. How relational approaches might bridge the theoretical continental and quantitative analytical, especially when quantitative data science approach to archaeology is prospering in Britain and Europe in general? And God, yes, it is. It was mentioned yesterday Deleuze was influenced by Levi-Strauss, who's an anthropologist no less obscure if we like obscurity. So why is Levi-Strauss not read more widely by contemporary archaeologists? So the first point is about quantitative things is, yeah, I do actually think there can be a bridging here of this sort of stuff. I don't think there's anything in Deleuze and Guattari's work that prevents us from engaging with networks or with large, I mean, this kind of comes back to that large scale point I was making before in a particular kind of way. I don't think there's anything about that. And you saw yesterday, actually, I mean, Keisha's talk was full of tables and numbers and these sorts of things. Was it really, compared to mine, massively data heavy or data rich? That's a much better way of putting it. So I don't think there's a problem there. For me, what a kind of relational approach forces you to do is to attend to things in the past and find ways of listening to them, if you like. And a quantitative approach is one way of listening to materials, especially at a particular scale, a much bigger scale than we can do, you know, individually potsherd by potsherd in a particular kind of way. So I do think that we can do that. And I think that any scientific quantitative approach, whether it's ancient DNA analysis, whether it's isotopes, whether it's big data, for me, especially with something like big data, it's not the, oh, this is great. It's not the size of your data, it's what you do with it that counts. So if you go out with big data and tell majoritarian stories, as someone like Rosie Braidotti would put it, of Bronze Age warrior hordes sweeping across Europe with their massive swinging swords, and aren't they all wonderful big men doing their big men stuff, then that doesn't have much to speak to the kind of archaeology I want to do. But you can use that data, I think, and re-employ it to explore minoritarian, again, to use the Braidottian, which is, again, a Deleuze-Guattarian term that comes through Braidotti, to tell really different kinds of stories. I think to unpick that, to pull that apart, to think about all those sorts of things. And I know this is something Rachel will be kind of thinking about later, so I don't want to go into that too much. But I do really think that is possible, yes. In terms of Levi-Strauss, yeah, really good question. I haven't read enough Levi-Strauss. There are circular things here. I think it's particularly Deleuze and Guattari where the Levi-Strauss comes in. So it's in Anti-Oedipus and it's in 1,000 Plateaus, much more so than, say, Difference and Repetition and Deleuze's earlier books, which are much more influenced by Spinoza and Nietzsche and Bergson and other people like that. I think it's when he gets to the kind of Guattarian work that the Levi-Straussian stuff comes in, which I think it is an important historiographic point when we think about how we're talking about the relationship between indigenous thought that's being fed through Levi-Strauss and into Deleuze's thought. It allows us to be specific about what's going on there. I do think we should read more Levi-Strauss. I was reading Viveris de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics is really interesting on this because he's tacking back and forth between Deleuze and Guattari and Levi-Strauss and the Amerindian stuff in that book. And he's arguing for Levi-Strauss, I think, as much more than the kind of structuralist, which is how I think he's been labeled inaccurately by lots of archaeologists. Certainly, I think I'm guilty of this, right? If I teach archaeological theory, Levi-Strauss turns up in the bit on structuralism. He doesn't turn up in the creation of concepts section at the end. And that's my inadequate reading of Levi-Strauss, but I think maybe that's how he appears in the dominant narrative. Ben, did you want to say something there? I saw your... No, all right, sorry. You were like, whoa.
I mean, I've got small things to say, but I don't think they're useful for the discussion.
All right, okay. Is that okay? If I caught everyone's questions, we're kind of pretty much at the thing, I think. Sorry for dominating that. I hope those answers.
No, not at all, Ali. That's the whole point. You were the panel speaker, so you were on to answer the questions, and that was very interesting. Thank you. And I have questions too I would love to ask, but I'll shut up and just moderate. So maybe at the end I can pose a few things, especially about Deleuze. But